Welcome back to World-Beater Wrestling. Last week we looked at being a hero or a villain in 2022 and why it's not always reliable to just go with common character traits. Now, if you want to find out exactly what I said it would take to be a hero or a villain in 2022, I would suggest you click on last week's video first and watch that one through. But I think it is important to have a little bit of a deep dive into character traits. Yes, I said they might not be a guaranteed way to get heat or to get cheered in the modern era, but I think it is important to kind of understand where some similarities and differences lie. So stick around and we'll have a chat. So hopefully you went back and watched last week's video. If you haven't already, if you didn't, I'm going to spoil you anyway. In my opinion, the key to being a heel or babyface in 2022 is very, very simple. A babyface gives the fans what they want, and a villain or a heel takes it away. What that means could be absolutely anything. You really need to know how to read your audience. It's a tough thing to do. It takes experience, being able to listen to the crowd and kind of work out what they want. One way that always helped me, and I know that many of the legends of professional wrestling have said the same, is listening to the audience before you even wrestle. Standing near the curtain, listening to what they're reacting to. I know that Eddie Guerrero used to do this a lot. And you can kind of hear the age demographic of the fans. You can kind of hear what they're cheering for. Whether it's a sustained cheer or whether they're just popping for big moves. You should be able to get a good handle of that. If you're first on the card, of course you can't do it. But if you're much later on, it's a really good habit to get into. But today we're talking about character traits. What are some common traits of being a heel and what are some common traits of a babyface? So what I did was use Google and I looked at some things that different writers in film have used to help write their stories and how they paint villains in the modern era. So let me grab my laptop. When we look at a lot of traits, you'll notice that there are some similarities. So first I'll go through what a villain entails, or what character traits you'll find common amongst villains. First one, arrogance, self-explanatory. I think arrogance is generally frowned upon, but at the same time, of course, there have been some pro wrestlers in history who have been arrogant and have been some of the biggest baby faces. In Australian culture, I find that arrogance is very heavily frowned upon. We also have cowardice, being immoral. Now, this is a tricky one because I think that villains aren't always necessarily immoral. At least they understand what right and wrong is, but they tend to push those boundaries. They're happy to push more towards the side of what's wrong as long as it helps them in their mission. They feel like they're doing good for the world, and even though they're on the wrong side of what might be moral or not, it doesn't matter because this is more important. But we'll look at that a little bit more in a second. They can be merciless, even to the innocent, persuasive, determination. That's a big one. Keep that in mind. Proud, deceitful, jealous, especially if the babyface of the story, vengeful, and a big one is selfish. Common babyface traits: brave, conviction, courage, determination, helpful, honest, inspirational, moral integrity, empathy, humility, protective, selfless, and strong. So firstly, I noticed a few similarities, which really goes to paint the picture that a villain is just a hero after a couple of bad choices. They often have similar personality traits, similar goals, similar endpoints, just very different ways of going about it. In terms of things that are different, the big one that stood out for me was selfishness. Being a villain often means being selfish. And when you look at the goals of a hero or villain, in a lot of movies, a lot of film, the goals are exactly the same. But the reasons for having those goals might not be. A villain generally wants to work for themselves. They want to achieve this goal purely for their own gain. Maybe it's power, greed, money, whatever it may be. A hero, a babyface, they want to achieve this goal for the community, so they're working for other people. So selfishness and selflessness are two opposite ends of the spectrum that I think villains and heroes often have. But that's not to say that a hero might not show selfishness at the time. Sometimes they make mistakes. They might be a little selfish. And at the same time, a villain can show compassion. Remember, all characters, no matter where they sit on which side of the spectrum, have vulnerabilities and make mistakes. I had an episode on this. which you can see in the link above. But I personally think that regardless of these traits, the most important thing or the most important no-no is making sure you don't go way too extreme on either side of the spectrum. There needs to be realism in what you're portraying because people want to empathize with you, whether you're a hero or a villain. People love hating a realistic villain. People love a flawed hero. When you go too far to one end, you lose the humanity and we can no longer feel how the character's feeling, the emotional connection disappears. Going back to last week's episode, I said that Stone Cold, the biggest babyface in the industry, had a lot of villainous traits. He was over-aggressive, violent, would break rules, but it's because he had a boss that he couldn't tolerate. And this is something that a lot of people empathize with. People understood what it felt like to be held down by your superiors. So I want to end this video by talking about another list I found, which was 6 tips or 6 rules for writing a villain into a story. And I think this is super appropriate to pro wrestling. So let me get my laptop. So the first one is a willingness to do bad things, which I think is self-explanatory. Kind of goes back to what I was talking about with moral lines and how a villain understands what good and bad is, but they're willing to go a little bit more towards the bad side because they justify it. And they think that it's for the greater good, so it means a hell of a lot more to do that than to go towards the good side and potentially fail in your mission. Which kind of goes to the second point, which is that a point of view, that a villain has a point of view that justifies their evil actions. Everyone thinks that they're the hero of their own story, and every villain should feel that their actions are just and that they're doing the right thing. I think the best heels in pro wrestling history always told that story through their body language, through their facial expressions, through their eyes, and through their words. You need to look like you believe in what you're doing. You believe you're doing the right thing. You don't understand why nobody else gets it. Some of the best stories in pro wrestling history had this as a center point, in my opinion. The next one is a backstory that explains villainous behavior. And for me, I hate when pro wrestlers who are heels just come out and just start yelling at the crowd. Like, why are you so mad? Why are you angry? We have to know what has pissed you off. If there's nothing, it doesn't seem believable. We can't connect with that behavior. There's got to be a justification for the actions. So think about you and your character and your backstory, and think about why are you on which side of the good or bad spectrum. If you're not sure why, if you haven't been put in many storylines yet, or you don't have much of a story that's been told, that's okay. You can create your own stories. Look at your win-loss record. Look at your track record. Look at any disappointments you've had or any successes you've had. Whatever it may be, look at everything you've done in pro wrestling and start to try to tell your own story through that lens. Number 4 is a complex range of emotions, and this is what always drew me to the heel side. I felt like as a villain, you can show so many different emotions that a babyface cannot do. You know, you can show things like frustration, anger, sadness. You can be a coward, whatever you want to do. I just feel like there's more range. Number 5 is a special skill that sets them apart, which kind of blends into number 6, which is that they need to be a worthy enough opponent for a hero. I think this is very important. I've heard before that a heel should be kind of dumb. I don't believe that in any way. I think it's quite the opposite. If a heel looks stupid, then the babyfaces gain nothing by beating them. Of course, that doesn't mean that a heel can't make mistakes or look foolish from time to time. It's a great way to get the crowd engaged and laughing at the heel after demonstrating villainous behavior. But a heel has to be strong in some way. They have to provide an obstacle for the babyface to overcome. A babyface who can overcome a massive obstacle is always going to get a greater reaction than a babyface who just rolls through the competition. So you need to have something. Are you strong? Are you intelligent? Are you cunning? Some of the best heels in history are some of the most skillful heels in history. And often they would kind of ride that line of the rules and what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, and they would use it to their advantage. So there's a lot to kind of look at there, and I hope if nothing else, it just gets you thinking about your character, where you stand, and some potential ways you could evolve it over time. Remember that a character that remains the same starts to get stale, so you want to look at ways that you can change and adapt to everything that's been put in front of you. For me, the best stories aren't always about championship belts or anything like that. They're often about internal conflicts. They're about character traits and clashes of character traits and how character traits change over time. Of course, I want to hear from you. If you have any comments about character traits and things like that, or any questions or requests, just pop it into the comments box below. Of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and I will see you next week for another episode of World-Beater Wrestling.
If you want to see more videos like this, click on the subscribe button, spread the word, and if you have any questions or requests for World-Beater Wrestling, don't be afraid to comment below.